From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Fed Chair Jay Powell announced a new approach to monetary policy earlier today that takes a more relaxed stance on inflation and its connection to unemployment.
Our new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time.
We welcome now Adam Posen. He's president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. As I've said, Adam, I can't imagine a better person to talk to about this today than you. Thank you so much for being here. So he's announced this sort of, if I can call it, inflation averaging at 2%. He also said we're really going to focus on employment, not be worried about too low unemployment. We really want to get unemployment down as far as we can. What significance does this have? And you might well say better late than never.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'd say, David. But I think better late than never, but also huge credit to Chair Powell, Vice Chair Clarida, and the whole group for the process. Look, it has been a reality going back to well before the global financial crisis a decade ago that the Phillips curve has been flat, which is the fancy way of saying, as Chair Powell put it, that you can have deviations in deviations in employment to the upside, and you don't get that much inflation for it. And then you combine that with the reality that we've seen in Japan for a long time and in the U.S. and Europe for the last 12, 15 years, that when you're too close to zero on your interest rate bound, you can't react as well as you should to to crises and adjust policy with enough oomph. And so I think what Powell and the FOMC, and importantly, it unanimously adopted this statement before he even spoke. What Powell and the FOMC are saying is they're just catching up with reality. And I think Chair Powell was superb, frankly, in framing this as we have to be realistic, we have to be pragmatic. This is how the economy has changed, and our policy must reflect the way the economy has changed.
So, Adam, you not only are an economist, but you've been a central banker on the Monetary Policy Committee over at the Bank of England. As we look at changing fundamental policy this way, we've talked repeatedly about the fact that we can't quite figure out why unemployment could go so low and we didn't get inflation. Did we figure that out? Because the Fed says they were trying to figure that out. Did we figure out the mechanism? And if we didn't, do we want to change the policy without knowing exactly how it works?
It's a really good question, David. You're thinking like Milton Friedman did 50 years ago of trying to say, okay, you don't just follow patterns in the data, you have to know why. And I think we do know part of why, but it's not all of it. One part of why is that economists and central bankers had blinders on. There was an assumption that once people dropped out of the workforce or were out of work for a long time or went into disability, they couldn't easily come back in, that if women moved out for reasons of childcare or fertility or looking after people, they couldn't come back in. And that turns out not to be true. So as early as 2014, Danny Blanchflower, who often appears in Bloomberg, and I were talking about looking at labor force participation across the U.S. states as the main way to predict inflation. And that was part of a broader movement of people pointing out that you shouldn't focus on the narrow unemployment rate. And so part of what we understand is that we were mismeasuring the actual amount of slack in the labor market. We just didn't understand that. And I think the Fed has caught up with that. But I think the other thing that's going on that was so important is that Chair Powell made a lot of references to things that economists would call the real economy, which sounds ironic, but meaning not just money supply or inflation expectations, but real factors like what's our productivity growth rate, what's our demographics, what's the effect of the pandemic. And pointing out that when the real trend growth rate goes down, that has effects on interest rates, on nominal things. And these are not things necessarily the Fed can control. And again, I think this is very reasonable. There isn't a great theory behind it, but in fact, the theory took us the wrong place because it used to say the Fed could determine inflation no matter what. Sorry to go on so long, but I think this is genuinely important what Chair Powell and the committee have said.
No, it comes across clearly. It is important, no question about it. At the same time, Adam, do you have any concern at all that the coronavirus pandemic may affect some of the mechanisms which has kept inflation down, particularly things like globalization and trade?
I think it's fair to raise that, but I think that the pandemic is having very long-lasting, potentially, effects on the productivity growth rate, on demographics, and those effects of the kind that the chair was already talking about, I think will be on balance more disinflationary than inflationary. So yeah, we'll have little shortages. People suddenly decide they want to buy free weights, or they want to buy meat for their freezer, or they want to buy, if they have a lot of money, a suburban house. So those goods go up in value. But at the same time, we're having a fundamental shift akin to what we had after the global financial crisis. Young people in particular, they're going to be more reluctant to take on debt. They're going to be more scared about losing their jobs. They're not going to demand as much in wages as a result if they have guaranteed health care. They're going to wait to form families and buy housing. And these kinds of factors, and then the lack of competition that comes out of lack of trade, which was mentioned later at the Jackson Hole conference today in the academic papers, that also pushes down on our productivity, on our trend growth rate. So the pandemic matters hugely, but I think it just reinforces the trends to make you less worried about inflation rather than making you more worried.
Adam, you said this is a constructive step, maybe overdue, but it's a constructive step. You give them great credit for it. At the same time, is this the medicine for what ails us? You've mentioned productivity a couple of times. If we're really looking for economic growth, as I understand it from you economists, we need to get either a productivity increase or more people. We're not getting more people. Is this essentially pushing on a string?
I think you're right, David. I think that you've understood the economists and the right economists correctly in this case, because, and Chair Powell, I think, was pretty blunt about that, especially in his responses to Professor Collins' questions of him this morning, that there's only so much monetary policy can do. Pushing on a string is the classic Keynesian image, and we saw that in the last global financial crisis, that you can provide liquidity, you can put a floor under credit markets, you can alleviate immediate stress in asset markets, but that gives you a precondition recovery. It keeps things from getting worse, but it doesn't create the recovery itself, because households are still going to be scared. Investors may not see good things to invest in. And so, as I put it yesterday, the monetary policy is much better at playing defense than offense. It can defend you on the downside from when things get really bad and you start having financial effects making things worse. But it can't really advance the ball on the offensive side that much. If there's something real going on, low interest rates aren't going to be enough to kickstart.
So, Adam, let me put you on the spot here. We've got a presidential election going on, you may have noticed. And I'll oversimplify, but I think it may be basically fair that we are seeing two very different economic approaches for the future for the economy. On the one hand, we have more government spending out of the Biden campaign, with more taxes to come along with that. On the other, let's cut taxes more from President Trump. At the same time, if you had to choose between those two, not as a political matter, but as an economist, is one better than the other for the economy right now?
Absolutely. It is very clear right now that the returns on public investment, including things like making sure our state and local governments are supported, including keeping open our educational institutions, including public infrastructure and public health, as well as energy, will have much higher returns than the average private sector investment now. It's also clear from all the evidence of the last 20, 30 years that tax cuts do not, especially tax cuts for the rich, do not have the benefits for the economy as a whole that people have purported they would. This isn't about politics. This is just reality. You can go back to 1979, 1980, and you can make those claims, and they had some justification because the marginal tax rates were very high, and also because the evidence wasn't yet clear. At this point, especially looking back at the Trump tax cuts the last couple of years, which before the pandemic didn't boost investment, didn't boost productivity growth, it just tells you it's a bad way to go.
Now, in fairness to President Trump, he would say it's not just tax cuts, it's also deregulation, and claim that, in fact, deregulation has already increased productivity, will do even more so. Some people even try to put numbers against it. Is that a fair claim?
It's a fair claim if the evidence supports it, and that's pretty much in dispute. The basic theory that there can be overregulation and that when you have too much, you can benefit from paring it down, of course, is right. But again, it's a question of, unfortunately, not just is there more regulation or less, it's which regulations you put down. There are regulations that we've cut by executive order by President Trump that have led to short-term growth, like deregulation of the fracking industry, downplaying of inspections and safety standards in food production and in worker safety. which immediately lead to growth in the short term, but come at various people's expense and don't really add to productivity in the long term. So it's not enough to just say we're going to deregulate. I mean, and this is what I hated about the Trump approach, not that every specific deregulation, but that they kept talking about things in quantity terms. You know, here's this N number of pounds of Federal Register we're going to set on fire. Here's how tall the list of regulations is. Who cares?
Right.
What matters is how good are the regulations, and that's something which people should be looking at instead.
As is so often in economics, it depends. Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate you being here. That's Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Coming up, Jeff Blau. He's CEO of the Related Companies, and he has been pushing to get workers back into their offices in New York. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you very much. Hurricane Laura is losing steam. The National Hurricane Center says Laura has been downgraded to a Category 1 hurricane and is likely to become a tropical storm later today. Laura made landfall in Louisiana early today with winds of up to 150 miles per hour. The biggest storms to ever hit the state and cause billions of dollars in damage. Laura is now headed toward Arkansas. President Trump will accept the Republican Party's nomination for president tonight and make his case for another 4 years. He will make his remarks from the South Lawn of the White House. Aides say the president will defend his attempt to manage the coronavirus crisis and argue that he's the best choice to lead the country through an economic recovery. The advisors have indicated he'll also look to outline his second-term agenda. The World Health Organization's top European official says the coronavirus outbreak isn't going away anytime soon. Dr. Hans Kluge described the virus as, quote, a tornado with a long tail. Speaking at WHO headquarters in Europe today, Dr. Kluge warned that rising infections among young people could ultimately spread to more vulnerable older people and cause an uptick in deaths. The NBA playoffs are back on, though not right away. ESPN's reporting that at a meeting today, players voted to continue the remainder of the playoffs. The decision comes after a night in which they sat out in protest over police shootings and racial inequality. Today's 3 playoff games will be postponed. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. Low interest rates and federal subsidies can help the economy tide itself over, but sooner or later, we need to get back to consumer demand and commerce picking up, and that will require people coming back to the office. Jeff Blau is the CEO of Related Companies, the commercial real estate company behind Hudson Yards. That's the largest private real estate development in the nation. And he's been speaking out on the need to return to work in New York. We welcome him now back to Bloomberg. So, Jeff, thanks for being here. I know that you're sort of on a campaign to try to persuade CEOs, leaders to bring their people back to the office. How much success are you having, and who are you talking to?
So thanks for having me, David. Good to be here. Yes, I am a little bit on a campaign and trying to recruit others as well. Basically, reaching out to businesses across the city, whether it's our tenants or others that we know, really to talk about bringing their employees back to New York City. This is really not a real estate campaign and has nothing to do with the office buildings themselves. It's about the impact of office workers on the New York City economy. And essentially, if you look around, we've been back at Related in our offices since June 22nd. We're 9 weeks in. And every day I ride around the city and see what's going on. And the city's very quiet. Actually, the residential neighborhoods are picked up. And if you go to the West Village or the Upper East Side, they're active, there's life. But if you go to the business districts, you go to Midtown, it's really deserted. And if you think about office workers, they fill those areas each and every day. And when they come to work, they stop at the coffee shop, they stop at the deli, they spend money, and they enable these small businesses to survive. And so the concern is if office workers are not back in the city, then those businesses won't survive. And there's really only 2 things, if you think about people today that are not in the city, either they're staying with their parents or they're in the Hamptons or Westchester, wherever they go. The only thing that's going to bring them back is two things. One is schools, which we're all hopeful will open next week or the week after, and their jobs. And if employers tell their employees that they don't need to come back, they're going to decide to hang out at their parents or in the Hamptons and phone it in.
Jeff,
Ultimately, businesses are not going to be able to survive that.
Jeff, are there some employers and businesses that are particularly crucial to this? I mean, I don't have a sense of it. For example, the big banks really important to this effort. Our insurance companies. Who do you really need to get?
I mean, they are critical just by sheer numbers, right? Those are the biggest employers, and they have the most number of employees. So interesting, this morning, Jamie Dimon came out and said all their new recruits in London and New York have to report to the office. Right now, that's a critical statement and a very important statement. And it also reinforces that you can't run business on Zoom, right? You can't bring new people into culture and training online. I talked to another CEO of one of the banks yesterday. He's got 2,500 new employees starting September 15th. How are those people going to know what that bank is all about, what the culture is all about? How do they even do their jobs? And so I think it's important, one, for business to operate properly, but two, and really the message here is we want New York to recover. And the only way it's going to recover if people return back to the city. And one of the main ways to get them back to the city is for people to go back to work.
What sort of longer term effects are you seeing in the real estate market, both commercial and residential, from your point of view? You have so many properties. For example, I believe at least you're converting Neiman Marcus, that really large Neiman Marcus at Hudson Yards, over to offices. Is there an appetite for that? Are you finding?
Yeah, so that's interesting. There's actually quite a bit of demand for Class A office space, maybe now even more than ever. And I think there's going to be a real differentiation between Class A and the older Class B buildings. And why that is, I mean, primarily these buildings, if you think about Hudson Yards, we designed these buildings for anything that might happen. They are super resilient, the latest sustainability initiatives, all that. Now, we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, but if you think about what happened, we were very, very prepared, right? These buildings have the latest HVAC systems and filtration and fresh air circulation and large lobbies and big elevators and lots of employees to do cleaning. You don't find that in the B buildings. So there is demand for I think you'll see a shift to the Class A buildings from the B buildings. People can go through without touching, complete touchless access. So the Neiman space actually presents a pretty unique opportunity. If you think about it, we started that retail 10 years ago, and just what's happened in the retail sector in a decade is unbelievable. And obviously the demand for retail space has declined. We probably don't need as much space. The demand for office space has been incredible, and so the ability to take our best floors at the retail and create 400,000 square feet of Class A office space, decrease the size of the retail, move some of the stores within Neiman's down into the remaining retail, really presents an incredible opportunity. And we are talking to several people now about taking that space.
So, Jeff, related is one story, both as an employer, the things you can do for your employees to bring them back, but also as a landlord, as an investor. A lot of people are not going to have the sort of resources, the financial resources to do that in your B buildings and some of your smaller employers. Can we really get back in New York if we only have the big guys, the JP Morgans and the Relateds?
No, the office people everyone's got to come back. And quite honestly, it's actually not that expensive, right? So we have an incredible protocol package. And that's another thing that we've been doing in talking to CEOs is sharing all the work that we did in terms of safety protocols to bring people back. We're not suggesting that anybody come back in an unsafe manner, right? Our protocol standards are very high. In the morning, you get an email at 5 a.m. asking you to take your temperature, answer 5 questions. When you get to the office, there's thermal scanning. Everybody's wearing masks, lots of social distancing. Conference room capacity is reduced, one-way directions, and all that. So we are doing all those things. They don't cost that much money. They just take a lot of initiative to get them done. And that's what we're trying to. We have a package of materials. We're sending it out to companies, and anyone that needs the know-how, we're providing that, because I do think that will help them get back. And I talk to our employees. In the first couple of days, people are nervous, right? They're scared. After that, the idea of being back together, being able to socialize, collaborate, and create innovation is really, people are happy to be back.
Jeff, while we've been talking, we had a viewer write in, suggest a question, which I think is a good question. As you talk to employers, is a hurdle concern about legal responsibility, that you might get sued if you brought them back too soon?
Yeah, it has come up quite a bit. People are concerned. I think the general consensus in the business community is that Congress is going to act on this. It does seem to have bipartisan support. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly an issue that people talk about. There's obviously no case law. Nobody knows who would ultimately be responsible. I don't even know how you would say that someone contracted COVID in a certain location. But I do think that Congress will pass a bill on that.
Okay, Jeff, it's been really great talking with you. Thank you so much for the time. That's Jeff Blau. He is Related Companies CEO. Still ahead, part of my interview with Home Depot co-founder Ken Langone. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Ken Langone, investor, philanthropist, and co-founder of Home Depot, spans the range from business and the economy to healthcare, being both an investor in Big Pharma and chairman of the NYU Langone Medical Center. I talked with him earlier today about the state of the nation as we move toward the election, and I started with the subject of the coronavirus.
The virus, to me, is rapidly receding in impact and importance. For example, the results in New York City hospitals right this very day are dramatically lower than they were back in April. Whether it's herd immunity, whether it's compliance, if you wear a mask, everybody wore a mask, 90% of the problem would go away, because that's the easiest way to convey infection. So I am very optimistic about how we're learning to deal with it. For example, one of the things we learned about at NYU was we had patients who have it lying prone, lying on their bellies. And believe it or not, it had a significant effect on their dependence on a ventilator, which if you don't have to put somebody on a ventilator, God, please don't. I think we've addressed the issue of supply of PPE successfully. And I think the pharmaceutical industry, by the way, deserves a lot of credit for the effort they've all made collectively, not with a profit motive. I believe, based upon hearing people smarter than me, that we'll have at least one successful vaccine by Christmas, and maybe more, maybe multiples of one. I think there's the antibody therapy, which looks very promising. And that could be, now that doesn't prevent you from getting it, but God forbid, if you get it, it's going to be very helpful in treating you. And if you haven't had it, it might give you an immunity for a couple of months. So the vaccine obviously is meant to have a longer duration. Now, as with any issue, I think the president made some good decisions. I think he made some unwise decisions. The good decision was jumping on it right away regarding flights in from China. I wish he had a different stand on masks, because I said earlier that masks to me are a very critical part of the defense against the pandemic. So I wish that he had embraced masks sooner and more enthusiastically. I think I would feel better if he had a little higher regard for the pharmaceutical industry. Let me say this to you, David, and I want to warn you, and in the spirit of full disclosure, I am a very major investor in the healthcare industry, in a number of companies. My biggest position in the industry being Eli Lilly. I give the industry straight A's for pulling together the last 4 months and doing what they could to help the country out of this morass. I think the effort they're all making now on a vaccine is very good, and I think their motive, thank God, is not their bottom line, but alleviate the tragedy that it's had on humanity around the world. And that's to me one of the redeeming features of the pharmaceutical industry. So I would say he's done a lot of great things, and I wish he'd done this. His passion for this hydrochloroquine, to me, I don't think it was merited. I don't think it's anything like the drug that they thought it would be. It has purposes. It's been around a long time, and it's effective for different conditions, and it might help a few people through the infection of COVID. But so what I'm saying is, I like some of the things he did. I like the fact that because they were arguing with each other the last couple of weeks, that he issued an executive order to help out. I'm thrilled with his compassion and his sensitivity to the healthcare delivery system we have in America, because NYU, we lost in 1 month $500 million. There were hospitals in New York that lost even more than we did. And thank God they got that first bill through, and nominally it's a loan. If it is a loan, we have to pay it back. That means we lost $500 million. Because don't forget, in that period of time, we stopped doing everything except dealing with COVID patients. We were overwhelmed by the number of people that came in. So we could do nothing but focus on dealing with the epidemic or the pandemic. So that's the best answer I can give you, David.
That was part of my interview with Ken Langone. He's Home Depot co-founder. You'll hear more of it tonight on our convention coverage. That's going to be starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Well, being the CEO of a major publicly traded company has never been easy, but it's particularly hard in the time of the coronavirus crisis and to boot, a recession. As we saw with Bob Iger, executive chairman of the Walt Disney Company, yesterday, when he tweeted out about the CDC decision to say maybe you don't need to take a test if you're asymptomatic. As Bob put it, he said, "This is beyond disappointing. It is actually horrifying." We welcome now someone who has sat in that CEO chair. Carly Fiorina was CEO of Hewlett-Packard. She is founder and the chairman of Carly Fiorina Enterprises and Unlocking Potential. So, Carly, welcome. I'm sure you can empathize with Bob a bit. He's got tens of thousands of employees. I'm sure he's testing them as much as he can, and then the CDC comes out and says, well, maybe you don't need to test them if they don't have symptoms. What do you do at this time? As I say, as a CEO, you have to not only manage the business, but you have to understand something about immunology.
Yes, and this is a set of very, very complex and difficult choices. But I think what CEOs want from the federal government more than anything else is predictability and stability. Just tell me what the rules are so that I can follow the rules and then do what I need to do to run my business. And so when the rules keep changing, and let's face it, this is a fairly, I think, major change in how the CDC is talking about testing. It used to be that we wanted to do trace testing and contact testing and all this, and now, no, maybe you don't. The inconsistency on mask wearing, all of that makes a CEO's job more difficult, particularly if they are trying, as your previous guest is, to bring their workforce back into the office so they can return to some sense of normalcy.
It's impossible, not just difficult, but impossible to generalize across the whole country. But if you were running a major company today, how would you strike the balance? Because you want to take care of your employees, and by the way, you want to make sure they feel that they're being taken care of. At the same time, at some point, we do have to get back to business, and by that I mean actually together, don't we?
Yes. Honestly, I think what I would be doing, I run a much smaller operation now, but what we are doing in my organization is I would go the extra mile in terms of safety. So I would go the extra mile in terms of testing, go the extra mile in terms of social distancing, go the extra mile in terms of mask wearing. Because one of the things that we've learned about this pandemic is we don't understand it completely, and we have failed to predict it accurately. And I am concerned, as I think most health professionals are, that we're coming into the fall where we may start to see waves again. So as an employer, you never want to put your employees at risk, and you don't want them to feel at risk, because if they feel that way, they're not going to do their best work, or they're not going to do their work at work at all. They're going to stay home.
And this is particularly complicated in a lot of places because people are parents and they have children that may be staying home with homeschooling or remote learning, things like that. How do you try to accommodate that and still keep the business going?
Yes, it's very difficult. And I will tell you, I am concerned about this aspect of it as an executive, an employer, and as a woman. I think there is an opportunity here for employers to take a leap forward in terms of recognizing child care duties of their employees, particularly women, because women still carry most of those child care responsibilities. But I also think it's possible that employers are going to take a step back. And I have read about certain employers basically saying, you know, if you're taking care of children or helping them be educated at home, you can't be working for us. I think that's really foolish. We have enough technology now. There is enough recognition that the workday and your at-home day have all blurred together in this, that I would urge employers to be incredibly creative about how to accommodate childcare duties. I would ask my employees who are struggling with childcare, how can we make it most productive for you to continue your work? Because virtually everyone wants to be back at work. They want to be contributing. They want to be part of the team. And so if you make it doubly difficult for people who have children at home, I think we are going to set women back in the workforce. And I think that will set our economy back and the company back.
Carly, as you know so well, we have an election coming up November 3rd, and you and I have talked about it a fair amount. We right now are on the eve of the last day of the Republican convention. You are a Republican. You have said that you expect at least to vote for Joe Biden this time. But putting that to one side, put your CEO hat back on. And if I told you you had a true choice on economic policy between, on the one hand, the Democrats who apparently Joe Biden says we're going to need to invest a lot of money, and we're going to have to increase some taxes to get that done. That's one alternative. The other is President Trump, who apparently is saying we're going to keep cutting taxes and we're not going to spend as much money. Which would you choose as a CEO?
Well, as a CEO, I think you have to think about both the short term and the long term. And so in the short term, yeah, cutting taxes is great, wonderful. But in the long term, we have issues that are holding our economy back. Our inequitable education system is holding this economy back over the long term. Racial injustice is holding this economy back in the long term. Communities that cannot participate, low-income workers who barely can make enough to survive, all that actually does hold the economy back. I really, truly wish, David, that Donald Trump in his first 3 months as President of the United States would have reached his hand across the aisle and said, we're going to do a big infrastructure build. And yes, it's going to cost some money to do it, but our lack of infrastructure, modernized infrastructure in this country is also holding the economy back. And so I hope Joe Biden will say, we're going to do an infrastructure build, and we're actually going to get internet access to all of these schools, no matter where you are, and we're going to tackle once and for all communities that have been left behind and racial injustice, because those things impact the economy as well.
Carly, in your experience, which is rather substantial, do the markets, which we pay an awful lot of attention to minute by minute, do they get what you just said? That is to say, will they give a CEO credit for looking over the longer term, even if it means their taxes, for example, are higher?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know anymore. I think there was a time when investors were investing in a company and its longer term prospects. As a CEO, I believe your job is to create sustainable long-term shareholder value. But when you have a stock market where the average holding of a stock is, a couple weeks at best, and a couple minutes more likely, it's hard to see people focused on the long term. Nevertheless, it remains the case that, by the way, it's also true, David, we've talked about this with the Fed's announcement today, it's even more true. Look, the Fed is going to keep feeding this market, and so investors may not really care. It's, it's up, away to the moon, Alice. But there is no question that our economy is underperforming its potential. It has been for the last several years, despite a lot of job growth. And there is no question that the economy will continue to underperform its potential if too many people aren't able to participate fully.
Carly, thank you so very much. We always benefit from hearing from you. That's Carly Fiorina. She is chairman and founder of Unlocking Potential and Carly Fiorina Enterprises. Coming up here, we're going to have an exclusive interview with Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. His thoughts on China, trade, and President Trump's promises for a second term. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Where we fought for free and fair trade, and this president stood up to China and ended the era of economic surrender, Joe Biden has been a cheerleader for communist China. He wants to repeal all the tariffs that are leveling the playing field for American workers. And he actually criticized President Trump for suspending all travel to China at the outset of this pandemic.
That was Vice President Mike Pence addressing the Republican convention last night. We welcome now the man implementing President Trump's trade policies, Wilbur Ross, U.S. Secretary of Commerce. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. So let's give us a sense first of what President Trump accomplished in the first 4 years, because I want to turn also to what you think he will accomplish in trade in the next 4 years.
Well, there are several very, very important things, most important of which is the revision of a very bad agreement called NAFTA into a very good agreement called USMCA. For most states, Canada and Mexico are two of the three most important export destinations. So that's a very, very important event. And what was done this time was most importantly to correct a grievous error in NAFTA. NAFTA had what it thought was good rules of origin. These were meant to limit the amount of material that could come in from outside the NAFTA countries and yet be counted within it. However, the rule was poorly drafted. The way it was written, it's listed the specific automotive parts that were subject to the rule, and many of those parts are no longer even used in cars, and there are many parts now, especially electronics, that weren't on the list. So that was the second problem with the list. It said that any part not listed would automatically be deemed to be made in the U.S. in NAFTA, regardless of where it was actually made. So it was an open invitation for Southeast Asian countries to dump material in, and that's just what they did. Well, this has now been corrected by the much better rules in the USMCA.
No question, that was something the president promised to do, was to reform NAFTA. We now have USMCA. He also promised to really deal with China in a quite different way. Take us through what you think was accomplished in the first 4 years.
Well, in terms of China, a lot has been accomplished. On the enforcement side, we really have been enforcing quite vigorously. You're familiar with the actions we've taken on Huawei. You're familiar with the actions that we've taken on ZTE, two major telecom companies. Most recently, we've been working very hard on the semiconductor part of things, because while China does have technology, we still have the best software design and the best fabrication equipment for semiconductors. So we're trying to avoid them taking unfair advantage of our technology. Technology is really important because while protecting things like steel and aluminum help take care of today's world, technology is tomorrow's world. So that's a big deal. Very recently, we put on the entity list of 500 companies since 2017. Awful lot of those are Chinese companies, and that's because They are the ones that seem to be doing the most to violate sanctions, to violate human rights, and most recently also to create problems in Hong Kong.
Right.
So that's been a big, big series. And then, of course, you have the tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs that USTR imposed on China. So the cumulative effect of all this is enormously greater than the long-term cumulative effect of everything that had been done pre-Trump.
So, Mr. Secretary, speaking of China and technology for the moment, we have the TikTok issue that is pending, as I understand it.
Yes.
And there are various companies now who have expressed an interest. I'm told Microsoft, Walmart, and Oracle have all expressed an interest. As you look at these possible alternatives, what are the criteria you use in deciding which, if any, of these make sense from the U.S.'s point of view?
Well, the fundamental idea is that we don't want detailed personal information on all of our teenage children who are the main users of TikTok. We don't want that information to become part of a big Chinese database to use to infiltrate our country. So that's the principal objective. Whether it should be Microsoft or Oracle or someone else, that's really more for the private sector to decide. The TikTok people are essentially operating in the U.S. and a couple of other non-Chinese countries. TikTok, as I understand it, does not really operate in China. So there'll be no particular impact on Chinese apps as a result of whatever we do with TikTok. My own personal preference would be to have TikTok acquired by one of these American companies. And I think that would have the fringe benefit not only of helping from a national security point of view, but creating more competition in the areas of Facebook and social media. That's a healthy thing. Competition is a very good thing. That's kind of what makes American industry thrive.
Mr. Secretary, as you think about a second four-year term for President Trump, there's a lot of concern that we may be entering into what some people call a tech Cold War with China. Do you believe at the end of 4 years with President Trump still in office, we would be more disengaged with China when it comes to technology?
Well, first of all, the Cold War in technology started long before President Trump. It wasn't only under President Trump that the Chinese were stealing intellectual property. Wasn't only under President Trump that the Chinese were requiring joint ventures, and lo and behold, the joint venture partners required technology transfers. So this abuse of technology, which you've called the technology Cold War, really had its origins many years before. The difference is President Trump is mounting the ramparts and starting to defend us against the technology war. And he's doing it with the whole variety of measures that I described before, but he's doing it also in another way in terms of the big initiative that was just announced about $1 billion for further artificial intelligence research and quantum computing research. Those are two of the most significant technological advances yet to come. And so putting money here, helping our companies go further is a very good thing. So there are two edges to what we're doing. The one is clamping down on their abuses, and the other is fostering U.S. technology. As I think you know, we've been helping to propagate in the Congress Senator Cornyn's legislation relating to semiconductor funding so that we can bring more fabs back to the U.S. I hope the Congress will go along with that when they go back into session, And if they do, that'll be a very, very good thing for America.
On Bloomberg Television and Radio, we are talking with the U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Secretary Ross, one of the things that we have heard a good deal out of the Trump administration is the fact that the coronavirus originated in China. There is a lot of concern that they were not forthcoming in disclosing what happened. A lot of blame and finger pointing, let's be frank. Is there any serious contemplation of possible sanctions against China coming out of the coronavirus and how they handle it? We've seen sanctions from the Trump administration in other situations.
We believe that they did not handle the coronavirus very well. Nobody knows right now whether the original outburst was something deliberate, was it leakage from a laboratory that was inadvertent, or how it exactly started. But what we do know is that at the same time as they blocked air travel from Wuhan to Beijing, Shanghai, and other big Chinese cities, they didn't block travel to the U.S., to Europe, and to Africa. That was a deliberate decision, and obviously that contributed mightily to the spread of coronavirus to the United States. Second, they've not been very forthcoming to our health authorities about what was actually going on over there. And in fact, as I understand it, they've now prohibited their virologists from doing joint papers with American virologists trying to sort through coronavirus. So those are not very helpful things. There's also some severe question as to how forthcoming they were in their relations with the WTO. So there's a lot to worry about in their handling of coronavirus. But be that as it may, it's pretty clear on a national basis that incidence of new cases is coming down quite a bit. Had been up around 76,000 on a 7-day average. Now it's down under 40,000. So it's still too many, but direction of change is a very good one. Plus, every day we're having announcements about a potential cure. Every day we're having announcements about a potential vaccine. We're going to get there, and we're going to get there pretty quickly. We will get this ugly monster under control. And the decisive action taken by the president, both cutting off travel to China early on, despite the objections of Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, was a very wise thing. That undoubtedly saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of American lives. Also, his idea of front-loading contracts to the people working on vaccines so that they would have production ready if and when their particular methodology cleared the FDA was a very good and very effective measure. And the third thing he did that's also consistent with his deregulation policy is he greatly shortened the amount of time it takes FDA to approve new protocols. That's a very big deal because one of the reasons drug prices are so high is that it takes so many years and so much investment to get a drug approved.
Right. Mr. Secretary, I really appreciate all your time today. That's Wilbur Ross. He's the United States Commerce Secretary. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Coming up tonight, complete coverage of the final night of the Republican National Convention. You can start right here at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And also coming up at 1 o'clock today Eastern Time, we're going to have an interview with James Bullard. He is the St. Louis Fed president. He'll be talking to our colleague Mike McKee. That's after Jay Powell's important announcement this morning. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.